Well, I hope you're all refreshed a little bit, standing up after having to sit there for so long while I go on and on. But I do want you to, before we get started, I do want you to know that that was still an abbreviated session. There's a lot more that can be said about almost every one of those works, but I tried to give you the most important parts of them. Can you see why it is I was intrigued by these? Why I decided to continue going on with this? It's so different from what I'm sure you would have expected to see in the catacombs. Okay, so we're in our second session, the anticipated Messiah. What the disciples believed about Jesus. It's very easy for us, looking back, to see all of the prophecies of the Old Testament and see them with 20/20 hindsight, and it makes incredible sense to us that, well, of course this is what they said. But not for those first followers of Jesus. And so we want to find out what they were thinking about Messiah. What kind of Messiah were they hoping to find? So we need to get back to this mindset of Judaism at the time of Jesus. Now, as I said, hindsight is 20/20, and not always the way we would like it to be. We need to discuss the nature of resurrection belief. Now, there were these two major groups of religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection of any type for any person at any time. This life was all there was. The Pharisees were a smaller group, and they believed in resurrection, but they'd only come recently, just not that many decades before the time of Jesus. They'd come to this belief that there was going to be a resurrection, but it was going to be at the end of time for all believers. But it wasn't going to be in the middle of time for one person. And I think that one of the passages that we'll confront here that gives them an idea of resurrection can be found. But you know, here in Acts 23, verses 6 to 8, we see Paul in front of the council indicating this difference of resurrection belief. Acts 23, verses 6 to 8. But perceiving that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." And as he said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say, there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit. But the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So here we see the dividing point between these two religious groups. And then in Luke chapter 20, we read in verse 27, "Now there came to him some of the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection." So it's interesting, off the subject, that the Sadducees were the ones who said, in Jesus, if this man had 3 wives on earth, who would be his wife in heaven? When they didn't even believe in an afterlife. So obviously they were just trying to trip him up. They didn't believe it. Now, where can we find some idea of resurrection in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures? Well, Daniel chapter 12 is one spot, and there are several. In the Psalms, you'll come to a couple of passages that might indicate something of that. But here in Daniel, you see these words. "Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, though these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." And so it goes on. So there is a sense there in Daniel chapter 12 that there is something after this life. And it will be for everybody. Everybody will have it. It's just who will be in the presence of God and who won't. Now, when we try to understand what kind of a Messiah the Jews were anticipating, we have to come up with several concepts. The first concept is that of the Davidic King. And in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 to 7, very familiar words are these. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. Thou shalt multiply the nation. Thou shalt increase their gladness. They will be glad in thy presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For thou shalt break the yoke of their burden, and the staff on their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, as at the battle of Midian. For every boot of the booted warrior in the battle tumult, and cloak rolled in blood, will be for burning, fuel for the fire. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So, what do we see here? This person is going to come from heaven to earth. He's going to set up his kingdom, and he's going to rule eternally. In this passage from Isaiah, you don't see that this Davidic king comes to earth, dies, is raised from the dead, and then sets up his kingdom. There is no death or resurrection identified with the Davidic king. He simply is a conquering hero who comes and rules. And this Davidic king is perfect. Then a shoot will bring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. And he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Here again we see this perfect judge who judges righteously. But he doesn't come, die, get raised from the dead, and then do this. He does it immediately upon his coming. So death and resurrection are not identified with Messiah. Now there's another concept. It's called the suffering servant. And this takes us to the book of Isaiah chapter 53, a book which we know now is a prophetic word about who Jesus was and what he would suffer. And we know as we plow through that long chapter, several things. He had no beauty, no majesty to draw our eyes, no grace to make us delight in him. He was despised, tormented, humbled by suffering. We despised him, yet on himself he bore our sufferings. He was smitten of God, pierced for our transgressions, tortured for our iniquities. The Lord laid on him the guilt of us all, and on it goes. He was cut off, he did not open his mouth, led like a lamb to the slaughter. All of these words, assigned a grave with the wicked, all of these words we see now as prophetic about Jesus and what he would experience. But what is the interpretation of this? What is the interpretation of this? Well, first of all, he's a figure, this chapter 53 is considered by many scholars a figure of Israel itself, not Messiah. Notice, for example, the servant is either the nation of Israel as a whole or a pious remnant within the nation, or their mission involves suffering to redeem the whole nation. Now, traditional contemporary interpretation, this is the figure of the Messiah, who's an individual of the future, God's agent in redeeming the people. That's contemporary interpretation, but not the interpretation at the time of Jesus or in the Hebrew Scriptures. Chapter 53 is a figure of Israel. Israel will be persecuted, but Israel will be vindicated. So again, we see Messiah doesn't have to suffer these things. He doesn't have to die. And if he doesn't die, then there's no need for a resurrection. And the third concept is that of the Son of Man. And this is the most critical for us, because this is the way Jesus often referred to himself as we read in the gospel accounts of his life, as the Son of Man. We look, for example, in Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man concept. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So here in this Daniel 7 passage, we see again this figure that comes from God to earth, sets up his kingdom, and rules. Death is not part of the story. And because death isn't part of the story, there is no need for resurrection. This is the view of Son of Man. Matthew chapter 12, from the Gospels. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign shall be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That was very confusing talk in those days. That he's talking about himself as dying and rising in this kind of oblique fashion. So, Son of Man defined. Well, it's a messianic title. And it stresses this manhood of a unique order compared to other men. For he is declared to be of heaven or from heaven. And he knows our human condition apart from sin. This is how Son of Man would be determined. So, when you get to Peter's declaration in chapter 16 of Matthew, we understand why Peter did what he did. You remember, Jesus is at a fireside, perhaps in some evening, having a meal with his disciples in the north, in Caesarea Philippi, and he says to his disciples in Matthew 16, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Notice that term, Son of Man. Now, in their minds, that means one who comes from God, destroys God's enemies, sets up his kingdom and rules. Who do they say he is? And they say, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter's the one who answers. And he says, you are the Christ. And that Christ is a Greek word. Messiah is Hebrew. They mean the same thing. So in some translations you'll say you are the Messiah. Others you say you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said, blessed are you, Peter, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So Peter is willing to say that Jesus is not just one of these prophets returned to be among them from their history, but he's a new person, this new Son of Man. He came from God directly. He had always been with God, and now he's here, and he's going to set up his kingdom. That's what he's saying. Now it's interesting, very interesting, that after this declaration by Peter, Jesus begins to speak of his coming death for the first time. Just a few verses later, from that time, Matthew 16, verses 21 to 23, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, be killed, and be raised on the third day. Now he's talking like this. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Now why does Peter say that? Because if he dies, then he's not the Messiah. If he dies, he's not the Son of Man. If he dies, he's not the Davidic King. So Peter's stopping him. No, this can't be. And then Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. For you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's interest." And this story is also told in Mark chapter 8, so it's not just one time. And now we see Jesus' words of cross-carrying, verse 34. After this declaration by Jesus, Peter's rebuke, Jesus' rebuke of Peter, he goes on to say a couple verses later, "If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, he must leave self behind. He must take up his cross and follow me." Many times in the Gospels, Jesus will say, you want to be a cross carrier, you have to pick up your cross and follow me. So right away, he knows what his destiny is. But the question we need to raise is, did the disciples understand his words about dying and rising? Let's check some out. Mark chapter 9. As we were coming down from the mountain, this is probably the period of the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John with Jesus. He gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man should rise from the dead. Now it's in the same phrase of a sentence. Son of Man, rise from the dead. Totally disconnected in their minds. He puts them together. And they seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what this rising from the dead might mean. You see, they don't understand it. Mark 9, 32 and 31 before it. He was teaching his disciples and saying, "The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later." Now get this next phrase. But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Then in Luke chapter 18, verses 31 to 34, he took the 12 aside and said, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished." Now, their understanding of the prophets about the Son of Man is that he's going to set up his kingdom and rule, right? That's their understanding. And then he says, "For he will be delivered to the Gentiles, and will be mocked and mistreated and spit upon. And after they have scourged him, they will kill him. And the third day he will rise again." And they understood none of these things, and this saying was hidden from them, and they did not comprehend the things that were said. And one more passage from Luke 9. "Let these words sink into your hearts and into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this statement, and it was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this statement. Now I can see that they're saying to themselves, he must be speaking in parables. You know, he did that a lot. He spoke in parables all the time. And you know, they always had to have the parable explained to them, didn't they? Even in Mark chapter 4, verse 33, we read, "With many parables he would give them his message." And then it goes on to say, "He never spoke to them except in parables." So here again, they must be thinking, he's speaking in parables. And they're asking, when he comes into his kingdom, which is when? Right now, they're on the way to Jerusalem. When he comes into his kingdom in Jerusalem, which of us is going to sit at his right hand? Now, Jesus knew what was ahead, but they're traveling toward Jerusalem. We've read it in several verses. And in Luke chapter 19, verse 11, it's written, "He was near Jerusalem, and they supposed that the kingdom of God was going to appear immediately." So Jesus is setting his sight on Jerusalem resolutely. He knows what waits for him there. Death after being scourged and mocked. But he also knows on the far side of it, he will be raised from the dead. He knows all of that. The disciples are on the same path, surrounding Jesus. All they're seeing is power. Coming into power. And when he comes into power, because he's always been in the north, now he's going to the seat of power. Now he's going to do what the Old Testament prophecy said. throw out the bad guys, set up his kingdom and rule. That's what they have in mind. And they're vying with each other over which one's going to be at the right hand of the power source. Mark 10, verses 35-39. And James and John, two sons of Zebedee, came up to him, saying to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? They said, Grant that we may sit in your glory, one on your right and one on your left. But Jesus said to them, You do not know what you're asking for. Think of Golgotha, one on the right and one on the left. That's not what they're thinking of. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, We are able. That came off their tongue so easily. So easily. And so they arrive in Jerusalem. Palm Sunday begins what we call Holy Week. The entry into Jerusalem. 1983. My, that's a long time ago for me now. Doy and I had just been married since the previous spring of 82. And I was on sabbatical again. And so we were back in Rome looking at all those artworks another time to make sure I didn't get it wrong the first two times I'd been there. And we happened to be in Israel on this occasion. And on Palm Sunday, we sat on the top of the wall on the east side of the city of Jerusalem, looking down the Kidron Valley and up into the Garden of Gethsemane and over the hills where this path comes down, the path that was first walked on that first Palm Sunday with the pilgrims coming down, singing and shouting their hosannas. And people from every country were there in 1983, coming down alongside the Garden of Gethsemane, crossed the Kidron Valley, entered into the city of Jerusalem right under our feet, because we were sitting right over the gate. It was a powerful day. A powerful day. And I can imagine the disciples with Jesus, when the crowds are doing that, I can imagine them saying, Hey, I'm with him. They're excited. This is coming into his power. He's going to set up his kingdom. Look at how the people are adoring him. Then they come to Thursday. Passover meal. Now, a Passover meal is a joyful celebration, commemorating the deliverance from the bondage of the oppressor in Egypt. But this Passover meal, even though everything on the table was the same, was different. It was not a joyful time. There was talk about betrayal, blood, death, denial. They must have wondered, what is going on here? Why aren't we celebrating? They still don't get it. After the meal, they cross the Kidron Valley. Jesus goes up into the garden to pray. The disciples stand aside. They fall asleep. How many times does Jesus go to them and saying, Could you stay awake with me even a little bit? He's sweating drops of blood. They're snoozing. The night has a certain snarl about it. The soldiers come with one of the 12, Judas, plants a kiss. According to one of the Gospels, Peter, ever the bold one, takes out his sword, cuts off the ear of the servant of the guard. Jesus performs his last miracle of healing. Jesus is led away. Judas goes and hangs himself. He wonders what he's done. Throws the money back. 9 of the remaining 11 disciples run for their lives. Peter and one other, unnamed in the Gospels, skulk along at a distance behind, go into the courtyard of the high priest just to see if they can figure out what's going on, what's going to happen here. Standing maybe far away from the fire so that their faces won't be illuminated. And someone comes up to Peter and says, I think I know you, I've seen you with him. Peter denies. And again another person, I can tell by your speech, or whatever, you're not from here, you must be one of his. Again he denies it. And then a third time. I can tell maybe by the clothes you're wearing, you're one of his. And Peter, for a third time, denies. Peter, the bold one, denies he ever knew Jesus. Why? Out of fear. And the cock crows. Peter weeps. Then we come to Good Friday. Good Friday. Jesus is led through the streets of Jerusalem carrying his cross. Bear in mind, he's been whipped and scourged beyond human tolerance. It's surprising to me that he could even have lifted that cross for even a moment. But he tries, and he stumbles several times. Jesus had been saying for 3 years to his followers, you want to be a follower of mine, you need to be a cross carrier. Sure, we're able, they had said. And now when it came time, where were they? Not even Peter the bold one was there. No one was willing to be a cross carrier facing into the crucifixion of Jesus. Not even those who knew him best. Not even knew what he had done. Raised the dead, healed the lame, cast out demons. He was not a normal mortal, and they abandoned him anyway. The Romans had to draft somebody unwilling who happened to be a visitor to Rome. Boy, talk about bad vacation planning. Simon of Cyrene carries the cross. Where were the cross carriers? After the crucifixion, guarding the tomb of Jesus, the Pharisees and the chief priests with Pilate. Now let's go back a little bit. Matthew 27, verses 59 to 66. Joseph took the body, this is Joseph of Arimathea, who had a new tomb that had just been cut out, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave. Let me stop for a second. One of the arguments of the people who deny that Jesus was raised from the dead is that when the women went back to the tomb to anoint the body 3 days later, they went to the wrong tomb. And that's why there was nobody there. But in this passage, they were there, they were sitting opposite the grave, they knew where it was. Going on in the scripture. Now on the next day, which is the one after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees, now bear in mind, the Pharisees believe in resurrection, but only at the end of time, not in the middle of time. They gathered with Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I'm going to rise again. Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come and steal him away, and then say to the people, he has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first deception. Pilate said to them, you have a guard. Go make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard they set a seal on the stone. Now, we don't know the inflection of Pilate when he said, you have a guard. It could be that he was saying, you have the guard you're asking for. I'll provide it. Roman guard. Or it could be, you have a guard, which would be the Jewish temple guard. So we don't know which set of guards were guarding the tomb of Jesus. But more than likely, to say a Roman guard would be the thing, because they're desperate here to squelch this ministry of this heretic once and for all. Now, if it's a Roman guard, it's 16 of the crack troops of Rome, lined up in 4 ranks, 4 abreast, in front of the tomb, dressed in complete battle gear, legs astride, a sword, a spear, helmets that made them look taller than they were, and shields. 4, 4, 4, and 4. The front row furthest from the tomb could sleep for 1 hour. And every hour they changed. And so they would get up and move to right in front of the tomb. The ranks would move ahead one and the front row could sleep. A Roman guard had to follow the law, which would be, when there's a Roman guard, only those authorized to sleep can sleep. And if any unauthorized of the 12 remaining guards falls asleep, all 16 will be put to death. You can be sure the 12 awake guards kept nudging each other. They were not going to let anybody fall asleep. So you got 12 of the crack troops of Rome, alert, armed to the teeth, awake in front of the tomb. Now, how is it possible that these disciples that ran away in fear could have come here and stolen the body? Good question. But there's a cover-up, because something happened. Matthew 28. Some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and council together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while you were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." And so they took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. That is, at the time that Matthew is writing these words. The story was that the disciples had stolen the body. Okay, now we come to the morning of the first day. The women go to the tomb. Luke 24, the first 11 verses. Now, why are they going to the tomb? See, these women had been following Jesus around the countryside too. They had heard his words about dying and rising on the third day. They knew those words. And now it's the third day. Are they going there to see that Jesus has been raised from the dead? No. They're going there to anoint the body. Why? Because things had happened so quickly on Friday, they didn't have time to anoint the body. Now, what made them think they were going to be able to roll a 2-ton stone up an incline and get in there? So when they get to the tomb and the stone is rolled away, their first thought is, who stole the body? Who took it? And it says, when they didn't find the body, it said they were perplexed about this. And then 2 men stood by them saying, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day rise again?" Then it says, and they remembered his words. Now they remember. He's not simply talking in figures of speech. He really meant it. And they returned from the tomb and reported all these things to the 11 who were gathered in fear, hiding, and to all the rest that were gathered with them. But get this. What was the response of the men and the others? Now, this is the third day. Jesus has been talking about being raised on the third day. The women have now seen that he's raised from the dead. They didn't see him, but they were told about him, and the tomb was empty. And it says, when the women said that Jesus was raised from the dead, the men said, these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. Now, to me, even though this seminar is not giving evidences for the resurrection of Jesus, we have here one of the strongest evidences I can think of. And that is that in a court of law at the time of Jesus, a woman's testimony would not have counted for anything. Therefore, they would not have been used in a court of law. Their word was unreliable, and they wouldn't be used. The very notion that all the gospel accounts say, give the first witness of the risen Lord to the women, would go against the culture of the day. They wouldn't have said it if it wasn't true. They would have given this witness, if they wanted to foist something, it would be men who would be the witnesses, not women. It's a great evidence, I think, for resurrection. Okay, that's the morning of Easter Day. The afternoon of the day, one of the followers of Jesus, his name is Cleopas, we know, is walking back to the village of Emmaus with another unnamed follower of Jesus. They weren't of the 12, but they had been following. And Luke 24 gives us this passage. And what goes on in Luke 24 is they're walking back. Now, where is Emmaus? You know, there's no town in Israel today called Emmaus. But there are 3 towns that claim to have once been called Emmaus. Why? Because of this story. Now, when I was looking for Emmaus, I went where there was a Franciscan monastery, because the Franciscans have had such a powerful voice for the continuation of the truth of Christ throughout the Holy Land, that I thought their word and where they live must have some kind of credence. So I went to this place that they called Emmaus. And it's about 7 or 8 miles west and slightly north of Jerusalem, a dusty road. And I can imagine Cleopas and his friend, it's all over now. They're gone home. They had been followers thinking he was going to come into his kingdom, and now all he's done is die. And they're heading home. And a stranger comes up and follows along. Now, they don't recognize the stranger. So now it's a flesh and blood person. Let's get this straight. It's not a spirit. It's a flesh and blood person. Because if it had been a ghost, they would have run. It's a real, living, breathing, fleshly person. But they don't recognize him. Maybe because they didn't expect to see him. But they didn't recognize him. And he says, "Why are you so troubled?" And they said, "Man, are you the only person here who doesn't know what's been going on these days?" And then they talk about all of these things. We had seen this wonderful person and seen all the miracles he worked and so on and so on. And then the critical words, "We had hoped he was the Messiah." We had hoped. Past tense. One of the other translations puts it this way. We had been hoping. Past perfect tense. In other words, finished. They're not saying, it's still the 3rd day, the sun hasn't gone down yet. It still could happen. There's still a possibility. We're still holding on to a glimmer of hope. No, we had hoped. We had been hoping he was the promised one of Israel. Then Jesus starts talking to them about the Old Testament prophecies and describing everything to them about what those prophecies meant. And then they get hungry and they pull off the side of the road by Emmaus and they have something to eat. And even the way that this phrase is written in the gospel accounts indicates something almost liturgical. It says, he took the bread and broke it and gave it to them. Doesn't that sound like a liturgy? He took the bread and broke it and gave it to them. And at that moment, their eyes were opened. They recognize it's Jesus. He's alive. And they can't stand it. They get up. Well, then it says, and Jesus vanished from their sight. Boy, that's a strange phrase. It doesn't say, Jesus got up, excused himself, and left, and closed the door behind him. It says, he vanished from their sight. What about a resurrection body gives it these properties, that it can be flesh and blood and just appear and then not be there? This is the resurrected body. And they say, did not our hearts burn within us? Yeah. Not until that moment. It had been over for them until that moment. Now they realize it. And they run back to Jerusalem, where the 12 were gathered, or the 11 and the followers. Now this is the second report of the risen Christ on this day. The first one by women, so you can discount that. Now this is by men, who have been with Jesus probably for most of that 3-year ministry. They say, we've seen Jesus, he's alive, and the response of the people gathered is they still are unwilling to believe it. These people are thick-headed. Jesus has been talking about dying and rising on the 3rd day for the better part of 3 years. Now this is the 3rd day. They've had 2 reports, and they're not willing to believe it. Doesn't that tell you that they did not understand those words at all? There was no possibility of a resurrection. That's not even for us to experience. It's until the end of all time. Not for Messiah. Not for him. And then it says, the evening of the day, Jesus appears. It doesn't say there was a knock at the door, they opened it, and there he was. He appeared. He vanished in Emmaus. He appears now. And he's not a ghost. He says he's a flesh and blood person, according to the Gospels. Flesh and blood, see the wounds. And he said, spirits don't get hungry. I'm hungry. Give me something to eat. And they gave him a piece of broiled fish. Now, if your brains are still working from the first session, in the breaking of bread, Cleopas and his friend recognize the risen Christ. In the eating of fish, Jesus identifies himself as being resurrected. Bread and fish identified with the risen Christ. And that is why when bread and fish are together, it's representative of a new kind of Eucharist, a meal with the risen Lord. We need to be celebrating that meal at least once a year. That's off the subject. So, finally, the third time is the charm. They finally get it. They finally get it. Okay, now we're there. Now there are other Easter accounts. Matthew 28, the women go to the tomb, see an angel, then see Jesus. 11 disciples are on their way to Galilee and see Jesus, though some remain doubtful. In Mark chapter 16, the women see a youth in white robes who tells them Jesus has been raised from the dead. They run away in terror and say nothing to anybody out of fear. Then Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, who then runs to the disciples, and they don't believe her. Finally, Jesus appears to two others, maybe Cleopas and his friend, who run to tell the disciples. And they don't believe this second report either. This is the account according to Mark. Then in John chapter 20, we see, well, let's go back to it. Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, sees the stone rolled away, thinks the body has been removed. Runs to tell Peter and one other disciple who race to the tomb, find it empty, and they believe. Until then, they had not understood the Scriptures, which show that he must rise from the dead. Mary Magdalene stayed at the tomb, saw two angels, then Jesus, and ran to the disciples, saying, I have seen the Lord. So let's assess the disciples' response. First question, did the disciples believe Jesus' promise that he would be resurrected? The answer to that question is a profound and loud no. Everything about their actions and their behaviors on Good Friday when they ran away, they're hiding through Saturday, and all day Sunday, until the third report, Jesus himself, was no. They did not believe it. Second question, after seeing the risen Christ, would it be logical for them to concentrate on preaching about his death? What's the thing that rallied them? Not his death, his resurrection. So if we think that the first message of the church was that Jesus died for you, we've got it wrong. That was not the first message. We're going to find that out tomorrow afternoon in the first session. Not the first message. That would be illogical to have gone through what they went through. Because, let's face it, the death of Jesus, what do they remember about that? Their fear, their denial, their running away, their humiliation? How could on Easter night, when Jesus identifies himself as living, how could they even look him in the eye after the way they had treated him since Friday, since Thursday really? How could they? Talk about embarrassment, humiliation. Scripture doesn't say anything about how they might have been throwing themselves at his feet, begging for forgiveness. for not believing. We don't know if they did, but it would be a normal human thing to do so. So the death of Jesus brought out all the worst in them. The resurrection of Jesus is the turning point, the absolute turning point. Third question. What would have happened to the disciples if Jesus had not been raised from the dead? They would have sneaked back to their fishing nets in the dead of night, looking over their shoulder to see if the authorities weren't coming after them too. They would have gone back into their villages, broken men. They would have been the laughing stock of their villages. You silly people, we told you, just another zealot. And all the zealots have done in Israel is lead people astray to their death sometimes. How silly you were to do that. Your livelihood, your families, all left behind. For what? For this? And don't think for 1 minute that those men would have ever mentioned the name of Jesus in mixed company again. In the face of any stranger, they would never have mentioned his name, because that would have indicated they had some association with him. And how could you trust that this person wasn't one of the authorities coming to retrieve us back for our own crucifixion? And I don't think they would have been able to look each other in the eye either for the way that they had treated Jesus. Even if he wasn't the Messiah, he was their friend. And friends deserve better than they gave him. Their lives would have been a shambles. And what is the legacy of a dead Jesus? Continuing fear, humiliation, sincere longing, maybe some question whether or not any of these prophecies held water at all. Maybe we should give them all up. Maybe there's nothing we can count on. Maybe there's nothing we can hope for. It's all over. Furthermore, not a word of the New Testament would have been written. Not one word of the Gospels, not one word of the epistles would have been written if Jesus had only died. And we would still be living in this vale of tears waiting for a Redeemer. That's the legacy of a dead Jesus. So we just can't have a good man who died thinking about us. That is not enough. That never was enough. It never will be enough. We can think all we want that Jesus was just a good man, and that won't cut it. Because if he if he wasn't raised from the dead, then he was a liar. And we shouldn't trust him at all. Two questions. First question, would the disciples invent the resurrection story? Well, let's check it out. They were puzzled by Jesus' talk of dying and rising. They were disillusioned at the Last Supper. They fled Gethsemane in fear. Peter denied ever having known Jesus. They were nowhere near the place of crucifixion. They didn't believe the resurrection report of the woman or Cleopas. Therefore, how could they, alter their understanding of the Scriptures overnight and accept the concept of a dying Messiah, which had been foreign language to Judaism in all of its history? How could they overcome their dejection and pull their spirits together? How could they change from fear of the Romans to boldness overnight? How could they sneak into the garden, past the guards, roll a 2-ton stone up an incline without making a noise? How could they take their time folding the burial cloths? Because that's what you read. They weren't scattered. They were folded and placed neatly on the slab of rock. How could they carry the dead body of Jesus silently past 12 armed guards alert and awake and dispose of it. How could they begin proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus when few people believed resurrection of any sort was even possible? And how could they do all of this within a few days? This transformation is quick. Second question. Is the resurrection a myth? First of all, myths take time to develop, sometimes decades, usually centuries. Resurrection preaching, however, began within 2 months of the resurrection. Resurrection preaching, first of all, started in the heart of Jerusalem, home of the enemies of Jesus, who had put him to death. The preaching was in the face of the ones who had sent him to the cross. How could they have done that if it was not true when they then were putting themselves at risk for their own crucifixion? Is it a myth? All the authorities had to do to dispel this myth was produce the body. They couldn't. Preaching was done by men who just weeks earlier denied knowing Jesus, ran away in fear, and didn't believe the first reports of the resurrection. And we read in 1 Corinthians 15, there were many eyewitnesses, even hundreds, including James, one of the brothers of Jesus, who had thought his brother was a lunatic not that long before. There's only one explanation. Something radical had to have happened. Something cosmic and earth-shaking. In a few short weeks, 11 men who didn't believe that the Messiah would have to die, who abandoned Jesus when facing his crucifixion, who didn't believe Jesus' words of resurrection, now stood boldly in the midst of the enemies of Jesus, proclaimed a risen Messiah, were willing to be beaten, imprisoned, stoned, and put to death. And not one of them recanted their testimony of the risen Lord. Not one. Would 11 men die for the sake of a lie? 11 out of 11? Even 1 out of 11? All it would have taken to dispel this was one person breaking and saying it's not the truth to spare his life. Just one. And bear in mind that these 11 men went in 11 different directions after this. They were alone. If they had recanted the resurrection, none of the other remaining 10 disciples would have known about it. It would have been easy to spare your own life by saying it was a hoax. So, what happened to these 12 apostles? Well, Peter, crucified under Nero in Rome. Paul, beheaded under Nero in Rome. Andrew, crucified, probably in Greece. Thomas, pierced with swords in India. Imagine, India. That's how far Thomas went. There is a whole group of people that can trace our ancestry back to Thomas in southern India. And I know one such young man. Bob Abraham is his name. Imagine. Philip, put to death in Carthage. That's North Africa, on the coast of the Mediterranean. Matthew, stabbed to death in Ethiopia. Bartholomew, there are various accounts of his martyrdom. James, Alphaeus, stoned, clubbed to death in Jerusalem. Simon, refused pagan sacrifice, killed in Persia. Matthias, burned to death in Syria. James of Zebedee, executed by Herod in 44 AD. Only one of the 12 died of natural causes. John, Isle of Patmos, who wrote the Revelation. Imagine that. Imagine that. So, it was the truth. The crucifixion of Jesus had made them cowards. The resurrection of Jesus made them bold. The disciples were transformed by the resurrection, and it became the fulcrum point of their lives, and in my opinion, the turning point of history. Now, if I'm going to be real honest, I would say the turning point of history begins on Friday and ends on Sunday. That it is the two events, the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, that make possible the single thing we need. The church's problem is that it doesn't recognize it has a problem. It's too easy to talk about the death of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. It doesn't take much. Death is understandable. We know that. We've all seen it. We'll see it. We have an entire vocabulary built up around death. We have entire culture systems created around death. It doesn't take faith to believe in death. And if we are to live by faith, then faith has to be in something that isn't so easy. And what is that? In the case of Jesus, it's the resurrection. It's not something you can assume. We can't talk about the death of Jesus and assume that people know there was a resurrection. It only happened once in history. It's not to be assumed. It's to be spoken about. But the church doesn't do that very well. Easter and funerals. That's when we do it best. But beyond that, it's too easy to stop at Good Friday and just assume that everybody knows the other shoe is about to fall in 3 days. We have to do a better job of that. So the two together, if I were to give you a summary of what my lay ministry is about, it would be putting these two events together inseparably, so that you never again in your life speak about one without in the same breath speaking about the other. Both together every time. And in our final session tomorrow, the fourth of the 4 sessions, I'm going to give you ample evidence to support the idea that that's the way Scripture does it. And we just haven't seen it. Because we see what we expect to see. And we don't see what we don't expect to see. So I'm hopeful that the outcome will be that we will see the inseparability of these two events. Jesus has to die for me. There is no other way. But if all he does is die, then I'm still waiting for everything. Because he's not a Messiah. Because he's not one who can save me. People die for other people all the time. That doesn't redeem the person who's left. So we come to the end of this second session. What kind of Messiah were the disciples looking for? What did they get? What was their response to what they got? We saw that. And what was it that turned them around? Well, what turned them around was the resurrection. The actual living presence of Jesus. Nothing short of that would have done it. Wouldn't have done it. Normally I don't do this. This is the first time in 340-some seminars I'm going to do this. But I'm going to read a poem by John Updike, born in 1932. He's not a poet. I mean, he wrote a few, but he was a short story writer. This is what he wrote, and he calls 7 stanzas at Easter. You can look it up in poetry books. 7 stanzas at Easter. And I think in this work we'll see that Updike is saying it's not good enough to think in terms of a spiritual resurrection. And let me say, even some of our hymns talk about the death of Jesus, and now he reigns on high. In other words, there's nothing in between. He didn't come back as a physical, flesh and blood resurrected person. It was a spiritual resurrection. A lot of hymns do that. We need to correct those. This is what Updike wrote. Make no mistake, if he rose at all, it was as his body. If the cell's dissolution did not reverse, the molecules reknit, the amino acids rekindle, the church will fall. It was not as the flowers, each soft spring recurrent. It was not as his spirit in the mouths and fuddled eyes of the 11 apostles. It was as his flesh, ours. The same hinged thumbs and toes, the same valved heart that pierced, died, withered, decayed, and then regathered out of his Father's might, new strength to enclose. Let us not mock God with metaphor, analogy, sidestepping transcendence, making of the event a parable, a sign painted in the faded credulity of earlier ages. Let us walk through the door. The stone is rolled back, not papier-mâché, not a stone in a story, but the vast rock of materiality that in the slow grinding of time will eclipse for each of us the wide light of day. And if we will have an angel at the tomb, make it a real angel, weighty with Max Planck's quanta, vivid with hair, opaque in the dawn light, robed in real linen, spun on a definite loom. Let us not seek to make it less monstrous for our own convenience, our own sense of beauty, lest, awakened in one unthinkable hour, we are embarrassed by the miracle and crushed by remonstrance. The fifth gospel. It's real. It's physical. And most of all, it's absolutely necessary. And the only way. The only way. Thanks be to God for this unspeakable treasure. Thank you.